LRE. LRE is the same premise, the same rules and regulations for children 3 through 21. But there are some caveats and nuances around serving children 3 through 5, as you all well know. We're going to review what the rules are, and then we're going to apply them to preschool. We're going to revisit our principles together. We're going to talk about how we braid together what the requirements are with our principles and how we end up making good, sound placement decisions for young children. We're going to talk about it like it's an easy thing to do, but we know how difficult it can be. With that said, it takes planning, and it takes collaboration to have a community system to support young children with disabilities. All right. My slides aren't moving. Let's see if we can, oh my goodness. Let's see here. Maybe there's a secret button somewhere. There we go. All right. So our agenda, legal highlights, we'll talk about what IDEA and what other Office of Special Ed programs has to say about inclusion for young children. As I said, we're going to talk about facts and we're going to talk about our guiding principles. We'll talk about the IEP process and the key areas that we want to apply to preschool. We've created some guiding questions. They're very common sense questions that you're probably already asking when you sit in an IEP meeting for a young child, but we wanted to put those down on paper. This is part of a package that we've been working on with the Office of Special Ed Programs, or OSEP, literally for the last 4 years. It's not published yet, but I do have permission to lead this conversation. And we might talk at the end about any additional topics that you may want to pursue. And with that, there's my little grandson. That's my oldest one. I've got 5 boys. I've got a basketball team. So let's start by talking about the legal highlights of valuing inclusion and how we know how important it is from both the lens of IDEA and from the Office of Special Ed Programs. So in the OSEP Dear Colleague letter on early childhood inclusion, and actually I believe the title is Early Childhood LRE, this is a quote: "All young children with disabilities should have access to inclusive, high-quality early childhood programs where they're provided with individualized and appropriate supports to enable them to meet high expectations." That is a great statement. It's a great bar. It's a high bar. We know that there are places in our country where there are not high-quality early childhood programs that are available at a moment's notice for young children with disabilities. And we also know that we have funding issues around who's going to pay for those placements, how is that going to be decided, and a lot of other questions. But that is our goal, to have high-quality early childhood programs where young children with disabilities participate and learn. From the IDEA, the Act itself says that they presume the first placement option considered for a preschool child with a disability is the regular public preschool program the child would attend if the child did not have a disability. So that's a great statement. What's wrong with that statement? That one's pretty obvious. IDEA wants children served in the regular public preschool program the child would attend. Does every child have that? No, of course they don't. So many of our children are at home or they're in a child care program. Now, for purposes of our conversation and the way that OSEP talks about early care and education programs, we're talking about any organized program except for family child care homes where a family or a family member or a neighbor is taking care of a child. But when we talk about public preschool programs, we're really talking about early care and education programs. We're talking about child care, Head Start, state pre-K, CDS run preschool, SAU run preschool. We're basically talking about the organized care situations in which young children with disabilities attend with their non-disabled peers. So here are the IDEA LRE requirements. And you know all these by heart, right? We know that we're required to the maximum extent appropriate, and that's really the maximum extent appropriate for the child, not the maximum extent appropriate for what we have to offer. We know that our children with disabilities should be educated with children who are non-disabled. We know that special classes, separate schools, or taking children with disabilities from regular environments occurs only if the nature and severity of the child's disability is such that education in regular classes with the use of supplementary aids and services cannot be achieved satisfactorily. And we're going to really talk today about, gosh, in preschool, they're 3, 4, and 5-year-olds. 3, 4, and 5-year-olds have a large range of accepted developmental appropriate, what am I looking for? They're all on different developmental levels anyway. So if we can't include children in preschool, where can we include them, right? So we're going to talk about that. Skills was the word I was looking for and couldn't find. We know the content of the IEP requires an explanation of the extent, if any, to which a child will not participate with non-disabled children in the regular class and in the activities that all other children are participating in. And you know, that's huge. As administrators, and if you're concerned about LRE, that's really the area in which we want to spend a lot of time talking about how are we justifying and who are we justifying, which children would not participate. Again, this is nationally, this is not in Maine, this is across our entire country. I taught, I think you all remember, I taught school many, many years ago, 75 to, I don't know, into the 80s, no, into the 90s. And all of my justification statements were the same, right? They were the same for every child. Well, actually, they were justifying the services that we were providing based on what we had. They weren't individualized for children. And we know that it's really important that we consider each child's needs individually. And the Department of Ed states that regular class includes a preschool setting with typically developing peers. And for reporting purposes, not for best practice, but for reporting purposes, the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, and the Office of Special Ed Programs define a regular class as classes with at least 50% children who are non-disabled, right? That makes it a regular class. So people question that percentage, but I think that you could make the case that if you're in a rural area and you've got 3 children with disabilities, and those are the only 3 children you have, you pair them up with 3 or 4 children without disabilities, and you can serve those 6 or 7 children. And that's certainly, you can certainly meet every child's needs in a situation like that. And once we get to 10 and 10, it's really hard to see how we're going to be able to meet everybody's needs, particularly when now we've ranged the skill level from children with probably there might be a child or 2 with more significant needs to children that are much more capable, that are functioning at a much higher level. And so that is just for reporting purposes. So keep that in mind. I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions there. All right, let's talk about the public agency or the state or district responsibility. So in the majority of states, as you well know, districts provide preschool services to young children with disabilities. There are a handful of states that do it differently and do it similar to the way that Maine provides service by using CDS as your agency delivering preschool special education. But the responsibilities are still the same. The responsibility of the public agency is to provide a free public education, FAPE, free appropriate public education to children with disabilities, including children 3 through 5 in the least restrictive environment. We have to make available the opportunity for placements in regular early childhood programs for preschool children if necessary to meet a preschool child's needs with disabilities. So I would say this, when we talk about young children, 3, 4, and 5, it's really hard to imagine a child, any child, that doesn't need the opportunity to be with children without disabilities. We know from research, and we're going to talk more about it as we go through the presentation, we know from our research that children do learn from other children. We know that a very important learning phase for young children is when they model other children. Sometimes they model adults, but we'd much rather that they were modeling other children. Now, that being said, if a child needs a preschool placement to meet their needs, then we are required to provide one. And the caveat is for the time necessary to implement the IEP. That's where your state has to provide more guidance on what that means. And as always, if the public agency does not have a preschool program that's inclusive and that meets the needs of these young children, they must explore other options in the community. That doesn't mean that you have to create a program. It means you can look to your community partners to see the best way to serve any particular child. You can start inclusive programs. You can partner with Head Start. You could partner with community child care, your state pre-K. Your state pre-K, we're going to have a slide about that, is really something to be proud of. Maine has a very robust preschool program, and you're serving many children with disabilities and IEPs within that program. So are there any comments about what is expected for young children? Any comments about determining the needs of individual children? Or what constitutes FAPE? Or your own state expectations for implementing FAPE in least restrictive environments for preschoolers? And Roberta, I forgot to ask you about this when we talked, but I remember at one time Erin had looked up for us. There's a caveat that you have about determining the hours that it takes to implement the IEP.
Yeah, there were two things I was going to talk about as you refer to what constitutes FAPE. And in Muser, it talks about 2 years prior to entering kindergarten and 1 year entering before entering kindergarten, and what a FAPE offer would start at as we talk about the continuum. And we talked about the continuum of LRE and placement yesterday with all the site directors. So I'm sure they'll be talking about that with all of their sites as they have their staff meetings. But we talked about the continuum of services and what is FAPE. And in that continuum, we don't start at the most restrictive versus versus starting at the least restrictive and building up. So for 3-year-olds, we're talking our FAPE offer is to start with on the continuum is 6 hours. And that would be possibly 2 times a week for 3 hours each. And then for 4-year-olds, it's 9 hours. So that's what our Muser says, and that's where we should be beginning our offer of FAPE as we consider the needs of the child based on, SDI or speech and language or other services. So just that's what Muser outlines as our beginning point of considering needs and FAPE offer.
Great. And the IEP team, which includes the parents, make those considerations. And you're so lucky in Maine to have that baseline to work with, because in most states, there isn't a baseline. And so there's no real direction as to how to consider it or where to start. So starting for 3-year-olds with 6 hours makes perfect sense. 4-year-olds, 9 hours. But that's not an absolute, right? We know that children are different. They may need more, they may need less.
Right, and that's right. It's all based on needs of the child and what the IEP team, including the parent, like you just said, determines meets those needs.
Absolutely. But you're very fortunate to have that guidance, because that really, really helps.
Right. One of the things that we talked about with the directors yesterday, because of this training today, is to try to understand that when a child's newly identified, what is the least restrictive environment. So and I'm not going to do any spoiler alerts or anything like that, but I just know that we did have that at the site director level yesterday, and I'm sure more conversations at the site level will continue as a result of that.
Great. Thanks, Roberta. All right, let's start talking a little bit about our inclusion facts. What do we know about inclusion? And then let's talk about our guiding principles. And I really hope that we will turn this into a conversation. So I'm sharing with you a video from the Desired Results video library. If you access these videos, there are tons and tons of videos there that can be used in training. California Desired Results and Colorado has Results Matter. Larry Edelman was the videographer that created all of these videos on both sites. On our ECTA website, we have a series also created by Larry Edelman that's on what preschool looks like during COVID and getting back into school. And so you might find those short video clips helpful as you do technical assistance. So we're going to watch, we have 2 videos here. We're going to watch the short version. This is called A Parent's Perspective on Inclusion in Early Childhood. And there is a longer 20-minute video called Team Lydia Rose. This is, the shorter version are just clips from the larger version, but the longer version gives a lot more information. What we're going to be looking at, what I want you to pay particular attention to, is what's important to the family. And I think that this video, more than any other video I've seen, really captures what most families want for their young children. And so as you watch that, consider what Lydia Rose's mother is sharing, and I apologize for the phone going off. And we'll talk about that when we come back. I'm gonna let my phone die down here before I start. This has been a morning. All right, here we go. And I hope that the sound comes through. Can you hear?
I can hear it, but you want to maybe turn it up a little bit.
Okay.
At 6 months old, the neurologist told us that.
All right, let me stop and do that.
And everybody might want to make sure their computer volume is up as well.
Let's see here. Yeah, I'm going to turn it way up, so I hope I'm not blasting you. All right, let's try again. I've got to share my screen again, and I've got to enable the video. Let's try that again. Oh, there's so many choices down here now. Let's see. Share my screen. All right, let's see if this is better. If not, just speak up, Roberta, and I'll try one more time. We should be here. Gonna watch for Lydia's mom. Let's go back. Let's go here. All right, we'll try again.
At 6 months old, the neurologist told us that Lydia had a stroke in the left hemisphere of her brain and a diagnosis of cerebral palsy, which affected the motor coordination, the sensory experience for her right side of her body. He said she would probably not walk, most likely would never talk. But you know, the brain has a lot of plasticity at this early age. We support her development by providing her with opportunities that every other child is provided with, making sure she's very involved in the community. We spend a lot of time at the parks, a lot of time at the library. I kind of decided that what I was going to do is I was going to immerse her and surround her with as many typical peers as I could to give her the model and the motivation to be just like every other kid. And she has followed suit with my plan and has kept up with all her peers. She does things a little differently for herself, and she makes up her own little modifications, but she doesn't miss out on anything. More than anything, I want Lydia to be comfortable in her life with her peers and her friends and her family. And so from the very beginning, I started looking at community activities that she could be involved in and be with typical peers and learn from typical peers. So at 4 months old, I had her going to the library for baby rhyme time. And we would be in a room with a bunch of babies, clapping our hands and singing songs. And then I started taking her to the preschool story times. So she was with older kids in the library, sitting on the carpet square, clapping her hands, listening to the story. And she's such an observer that she really has taken the reins. I kind of put her on a path and then she goes running down it. So at the library, she would watch the other kids and want to do what they were doing. And that was the most important thing to me, that she had the motivation and the perseverance to keep up with her peers. And she's done that. And her being in a classroom full of children with all sorts of abilities has just enhanced that experience. So starting at the parks and the libraries, and then now being in school, she doesn't know she's any different, and 99.9% of people in public don't know she's any different either until I share with them. And I share a lot. I'm an open book in public. People ask me, or kids ask, because she wears a brace on her hand and she wears a brace on her foot. So in that way, there is a visual for people to see, oh, what's happening there? And when I get the kind of quizzical looks, I'm happy to share. She had a stroke. It's harder for her to use her right arm and her right leg. And these supports really help her to straighten out her muscles and allow her to move her body the same way that you move your body. And the response I get from kids is like, oh, okay. They think she got hurt or there's some sort of injury because she has a brace on her arm. But when I tell her it's just like to help her, they pay no mind to it. And I like that curiosity, and I always thank people. Thank you for asking about that, because I'm glad that you know about it. And I'm gonna teach Lydia that throughout her life, to share her story and to tell people what is going on with her and her body, and to feel empowered in that. She's a child that needs more support, but I see her running right along with all her peers in every way. I see her playing sports. I see her in a typical classroom. I see her sharing her experience with other kids, and if she needs a modification, a different type of pencil grip, or help with scissoring or things like that, I see that as just a small thing. I don't think it's gonna make a huge difference in her life. And I think it will be great for not only her to be at peace with needing those supports, but I think it will be great to show her peers that it's okay for different people to need different things to succeed. The fact that she's been included starting at really 6 months old at the point of diagnosis has been profoundly impactful in her success.
All right. What did you hear from Lydia's mom? What was important to her?
And I'm going to encourage people to unmute themselves and ask those questions out loud, because we don't have a chat box. And then after we have this discussion, Deb, maybe we could take a 5-minute break and set up a Google Doc for questions where we don't have a chat box. But I think
Sure.
I think while we have this video, which was to me the most awesome video I've seen in a long time, that we have an open and honest conversation about inclusionary practices with children with disabilities into the regular ed. That was a very awesome video. And then I would say that we'll take a 5-minute break after that, but let's have that discussion right now. Please feel free to unmute, because I want to hear your thoughts on that, given our capacity to provide services and thinking about inclusionary practices. I really would like to hear some feedback on that.
That was just really for me. And at our CDS preschool in Rockland, it's been a special ed placement for the past few years because the need has been so great, and we felt like we really needed to save our spots for the children who needed special education. But Gail and I were just talking yesterday about the importance of getting some typically developing kids in there, and that just reinforced what we were talking about yesterday, and I think we really need to move in that direction.
Perfect.
Thanks, Katie. Thank you so much. Did anything that Lydia Rose's mom say have an impact or make an impression on you about what she wanted for her daughter?
For me?
Yes.
Absolutely. I mean, I think the whole concept of just that she needed to be exposed to typically developing kids and understand and recognize her potential was just, yeah, really, really hit home.
Thanks so much for being the first one to speak up. We appreciate it. What others think?
So what spoke to me is not only are we educating, putting these children in these programs, educating that child, but we're educating others on disabilities. That little girl is educating her peers on disabilities. And I just think that if you start at that age, what an impact you can make. And that just really touched me a lot, where the mother encourages the children to ask questions. And then after asking the questions, the kids are like, yeah, no big deal.
Absolutely, Rebecca. That is such a powerful thing. And, you know, it really can help cut down on bullying later on. Young children, when they're exposed to other children with different abilities, they're curious, but they're curious for a nanosecond. And then their curiosity's gone away and they're very accepting. So I appreciate that comment. What did others hear?
What I found was that it didn't seem like she required any type of supports in the classroom, that she was able to participate without needing any, or at least they didn't talk about any accommodations or things. So I'm just wondering, you know, is that still going to be as effective if we need to put special education supports in place in the regular education classroom? Is she still going to feel like, you know, there is no difference between her and somebody else? How would we accomplish that?
Great, Lori. Thank you for that question. It's always going to be individualized, but I would say that this child, we don't know all of her abilities. This could be a child that couldn't speak, right? We know often when you have a stroke, you can't even speak. So she may have a slew of supports that we weren't seeing. It's certainly possible. So those decisions and those conversations have to be made on an individual child level. But we're going to talk as we keep going this morning about some of our research that shows children with the most significant disabilities make the most progress when they're included. And when we talk about inclusion, this is a good place to stop and say, we're not saying every child, every minute in an early childhood class, exactly like every other child. We're saying the premise is we start with every child in a regular early childhood program for the amount of time that the children are typically there, whether it's childcare or for a 3-year-old, maybe it's a Mother's Day Out program. There's a wide range. There is not one set of hours that works for every child or every family, right? There's different reasons why families choose childcare than a play group, for example. But what we want to think about is, what's it going to take? Not why can't the child be there? What's it going to take to support this child in this setting? There's not a whole lot that goes on in preschool until a child is ready for kindergarten that can't be accommodated for any child. I've taught for many, many, many years, and I taught before we even had preschool special education. And I want to say that I wasn't a believer of inclusion. I'll talk about that more in a minute, but I can count on one hand. I worked at the State Department of Education in my state and had Roberta's job. And one of my responsibilities was to travel the state, go to very difficult IEP meetings, go to those classrooms where children were really struggling. There have been only a handful of children in my 25 years in the classroom or at the State Department where a child really needed the level of support that because that child struggled so in a classroom. And it really can happen. It can happen for short periods of time and build up to longer periods of time. We did have a child that came into the classroom and he got to be in the front of the class and all the other children were in the back of the class. That's exactly how we had to start because he was quicker than most of us. But there are ways to do it. And so I think that our challenge is, how do we do that for each individual child? You can start with more limited hours if you must, but again, start from that position of, what are all the children doing here in this classroom? How's this child going to fit in? Then only take that child out of that situation if their disability requirements requires it. The other thing I'll say, I taught young children with significant needs. I taught young children with autism. We had a very strong training program here across our state, which I helped implement. It is so critically important that we get out of the mindset that we have to have children with like disabilities together. We absolutely do not. When we do that, we're doing it because that's where our level of expertise is, right? Children with autism don't benefit from being with other children with autism that aren't yet speaking or aren't yet communicating or don't yet have high level of social skills that other children can model, right? That type of program is because we're concentrating our expertise in one area. We'll talk about that more because it's really important to think differently about how we start viewing young children and the services that they need. I'm going to keep going now and pull the PowerPoint back up. Any other comments about the video before I do that?
Debbie,
Yes.
so I think one of the barriers from, being in CDS a long time is that the number of children who get kicked out of childcare and kicked out of preschool that we then get referrals for. And then we're faced with, well, where do we put them? Because they can't function in that environment at this point. So oftentimes we would move them to something more restrictive. I think as far as children with autism, I personally ran a school for children with autism for 15 years. And what I saw was for some children, because their disability was so significant, they needed something restrictive for a time to learn how to learn in something very restrictive. But we had a full continuum within our school so they could move into a less restrictive setting as soon as they could access it with typical children. And at that point, they were really, really successful.
Those are great points, Lori. Thank you. So a couple of things. Children should not be getting kicked out of programs anymore. We know that's happening. We know that there should be supports across the early childhood community to support young children within those programs. Oftentimes when children are getting suspended or expelled from early learning programs, it's because of the situation of the program, right, that can't meet the child's needs. So it's not that the children require it, it's that the program needs to do something differently or have fewer children, which is not always possible in some programs. I certainly understand that. But I'm saying that proactively, there are many, many things we can do. I really appreciate what you said about young children being ready to learn, and that they can do both. They can spend time in a regular classroom while they're learning those discrete skills that are so important. I don't disagree with you at all, but what I am saying is those discrete and really individualized skills can be taught within a classroom routine. And it's not more expensive, and it's not necessarily taking more personnel to do it. We just have to be smarter about how we're going about it. And we're learning these things all the time, right? I also taught in those self-contained classrooms, and I advocated for those classrooms because we worked really hard to let people know that we had the specialty training, we had the professional training that it took to work with those children. But it's not rocket science, and we can teach our partners how to do it too. So I absolutely agree with what you said. So appreciate that the goal is to have children in the regular early childhood program. We just want to kind of flip things because often we hear a label for a child and we think a particular service needs to match it. Thank you, Lori. We'll keep talking about this. Any other comments? So just a couple things that I heard Mom say. She wants her child to have opportunities like every other child. And those are the same thing that all of us as parents or grandparents want, right? She wants her child to be comfortable in her own skin. She wants her to embrace her disability and not be afraid to look for accommodations and ways to make things work and to be creative. She talked about children as observers. And I can't say enough that if a child is sitting in a regular early childhood classroom and may look like they're not participating, we can only imagine how much they're picking up from the routines that the other children are participating in. We know that young children are observers. It's part of the developmental trajectory. So we can explore that more. Peers provide motivation. We know that. When children see other children doing things that they're not yet able to do, many children just automatically, it's innate to them, want to model what those other children are doing, and they're motivated to do it. And finally, she said that inclusion has been profoundly impactful for her daughter. And again, we don't know the supports that young girl was receiving. That child could have been a child with very significant autism with very limited communication skills. We didn't see that from that clip, and we didn't see how that might have impacted her. All right, Roberta, do you want to take a 5-minute break right now?
I think so, because I think there are questions, but because there are not, there isn't a
Okay.
chat box. It'd be great if we could set up some way to at least get those questions in the moment.
That'd be great. Thanks so much. We'll be back at 9:50.
And so that's what you set up last time. Is that something that you can do? I
Oh,
don't know.
yes.
I
can.
don't have access to Google
Yes, I
Docs
can.
at the state level. They don't allow us to
Sure,
have that.
sure. Let's see here.
And I received a couple emails of wanting the opportunity to ask questions. So as
Good. All right, let's see here. You know, I couldn't find chat in Zoom on another application that I was doing the other day and thought I'd lost my mind.
if you could also make me co-host, I might be able to explore how to open that or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not. Oh, do I have to do it?
Yes, because when
Oh, that's right. All right.
because when Robin made you host, she made you full host. So
I'm
just,
sorry. I thought you were talking
no,
to
that's
Robin.
okay.
Of course you were talking to me. Whoops,
That's
keep going
okay.
in the wrong place. I'm gonna have to be quiet so I can think about what I'm
I know.
doing.
I asked you to do 2 things: set up a Google Doc and make me
Let's
co-host.
see. Oh, here's where I need to be. Okay. All right, let's go to a new one.
I think that's the most awesome video I've seen in a long time.
Oh,
Thank
good. The 20-minute one's good too.
Yeah.
Oh, let's see here. All right. Do you want it to be a table so that everybody can pick a block to put a question in?
Sure, and if you can just send it to me in the email, and then
Yep.
I'll send it out, and I'll just keep track of that while you're.
Yep.
I think that's probably the best way to do it. And in the meantime, I'll try to look for the chat box app once you make me co-host.
I'll do that. I've got 20 lines here. Let's see if I can get 20 more. I don't know that we'll have that many. Well, people can just put them in the bottom if they need to.
Yep.
All right, let me save this. All right. Roberta, make sure you're able to type into it, but you should be able to.
Okay.
All right. Miss having that chat box.
Yeah, Robin thinks she might have some solution to that, but we'll once you
Okay.
make me co-host,
I will.
I'll give it a whirl.
Getting that email out. All right, that's on its way. Let's put my email away. And let's go back to here and make you a co-host. And some people are patiently waiting for us to get started again.
That's okay. I mean,
Let's see
we're good.
here.
We're good. This is, sometimes breaks help us process too.
That's true. All right, you are now a co-host.
Perfect. Okay. so
Okay, I'm going to see if you've got that Google Doc and you can send that link out.
all right. You can take a break too if you need it.
I'm good. I'm really good.
Okay.
You tell me when you're ready and then we'll get back. I've got just another minute.
Hasn't come through yet, Deb.
Oh,
That's okay. It will. Time lag.
yeah.
Here it is. I just got it.
Good. Great.
Now let me see if I can open it. I can.
Perfect.
And I'm going to forward it now to everybody that I forwarded it to before.
All right. I think we still have about 1 minute left and then we'll get started.
Okay.
It is freezing cold here today.
Oh, it's cold here today.
We have not had a day over 70 something this whole spring. And usually we're in the 90s by now. It's just been freezing. I guess I shouldn't characterize that as freezing, but it's just been so unusually cool.
Yeah. Miller and then Pam. Okay.
And we do appreciate so much that you're unmuting. Conversation is much better than questions on paper, but we're glad to get your questions submitted as well.
Okay, I just sent it out to everybody again. So as soon as everybody comes back, we'll.
All right, I think we're ready to get started then.
And I'll keep the doc open and see if once people start to get it, they write their questions on it. So, and I'll let you know as they pop up. How's that?
All right. And I'm not able to share my screen right now. I wonder what that's about.
Oh, you can?
Close it. Let me try it again. Oh, I know what it's about. This one's making me choose a window. I'm not used to that. All right. Uh-oh. Oh, let's see if I can. All right.
All right.
Are you seeing my screen?
Yes, we are.
All right. Well, it's got a mind of its own now. It's not closing that out.
So welcome back, everyone. I know we're about a minute afterwards. I just sent all the CDS directors and Tammy and Amy and Pam a link to a document, a Google Doc, where you can write your questions in for this, for the rest of this. And if you had questions that you wished you could have asked before, please go right ahead and type them in there. And then as they pop up, I will ask Deb the questions as we go through them. So feel free to open that link up and put your questions right in there. That will be helpful.
Thanks so much, Roberta. So I believe this is where we left off. We're going to talk about inclusion facts and guiding principles. All right. So you have the link, this link. I believe this also came in an email standalone link to you. This is a brief summary fact sheet of the research on early childhood inclusion. The link is also in the blue at the bottom, footnoted. There is a longer version of this document, but this is a synthesis of all the research. I think it's about 4 or 5 years old now, maybe a little bit older, but it's a synthesis of the research that exists on early childhood inclusion. And on the brief summary, you'll see the statement that's presented in a little more detail, and you will see some of the major citations. However, the longer fact sheet, if you are really into the research, will give you a lot more information about what the research study was and exactly what it found. But this is what we know from research around early childhood inclusion. We know that the data hasn't changed much over time. Now, we've changed how we collect the data, but we still know the data hasn't changed much over time, and that not too many children are attending regular early childhood programs and receiving the majority of their special ed and related services in those programs. We know that. We also know now that the kindergartners are being taken out and reported with school age. Data is really going to shift again, and we're going to find, we believe, that inclusion isn't even going as well as we thought it would. What we do know is that about 2/3 of the children across the country, ages 3 through 5, have access to some type of regular early childhood program. It might be an afternoon childcare. It might be organized Mother's Day out event. It might be Head Start. It might be state pre-K. But we also know that less than half the children with disabilities are not getting their services there. And again, as I said, our data is going to look worse next year after taking those kindergartners out. We know from research that inclusion benefits children with and without disabilities. And Rebecca, I believe it was, shared with us how important that is. I can't begin to talk about the wonderful things that happen when young children are successfully included. And by that, I mean, we've set the parameters to make it a high quality experience by being planful about it, by having caseloads that make it happen. It doesn't just happen when we plop a child in a classroom. It takes a lot of hard work, but we know that the benefits for all children and I would say families and teachers as well, exist when we have children with and without disabilities in the same classroom. We also know from research that the quality of inclusive classrooms is good or better when children with disabilities are in the classroom. That's for a lot of reasons. Many of us, like probably Roberta and myself, we're trained as special ed generalists because there wasn't preschool special education when we started our careers. And so we had to go back and get information about what does it take to be a regular early childhood teacher? What are developmental things what are the developmental skills that all young children should know? We skipped that part. And so when I was teaching my class of young children and I taught them how to count by tens to 100, what a great skill that they couldn't possibly use for anything because it didn't match their everyday routines or activities. And so my young children with very significant disabilities could count to 100, could count by 10. But when I said, go get 3 cartons of milk, they could not do that because we didn't teach our skills within the context of activities and routines. And we were teaching skills without the benefit of really matching it to what developmental milestones, expectations, and skills really are, because we didn't know what they were. And so when we're all together, our work is good or better, and we know that from research. Children with disabilities can learn with specialized instruction. Specialized instruction, my goodness. We had classrooms for young children with disabilities, and we're working very hard because most developmental skills don't need to be taught. They're learned just by young children participating in the context of everyday routines and activities, observing other children, watching the routines of other family members. They learn, they absorb, they take in those skills. And few children need much instruction, as we know it in a typical way, to learn those skills. But one of the hallmarks of special education is the definition of what is the specialized instruction that young children need to acquire skills. And one of the things we know is that breaking down skills, backward chaining skills, all of the different strategies that have been considered for working with young children with disabilities, they work with all children. When you think of the pyramid model and how to teach social skills, how to be very, very intentional about teaching children to get along with one another, because it is not a natural thing for 2, 3, 4-year-old children to be in classrooms with 16, 18, or 20 children. That's really not their natural environments. Those are environments that we've created for them. So for example, biting is a very natural thing for a 2-year-old or a 3-year-old sometimes. It's a form of communication, but it certainly, to Lori's point, will get you kicked out of an early childhood program if that's not dealt with in a very quick manner. So we know that specialized instruction can be generalized for all children. What's specialized about much of the instruction that we do for our children with disabilities is that we make an intentional plan to match the specialized instruction with the individual child. And then it's our responsibility to ensure that it's delivered, that we follow up on it, that we take data on how the child's doing on a particular skill and so forth. We also know that parents and teachers influence children's values. If parents and teachers value inclusion, children will too. But you know what? I almost think that one needs to be flipped. Children definitely have very little problem with young children with the most significant disabilities. But when we turn that around, they can certainly help influence their parents and teachers by their accepting natures. Here's some more facts on early childhood inclusion. Embedded instruction can be very effective. By embedded instruction, we're talking about kind of hiding those teaching moments within the routines of children. It's kind of like also pivotal skill training if you're familiar with teaching pivotal skills. Families of all children are generally positive about inclusion. Again, we're talking about inclusion that is planful, intentional, and high quality. Inclusion is not necessarily more expensive. There may be a particular child for whom it's more expensive, but if you're doing that as a regular way of doing business, it is not more expensive. There may be isolated rural places that make it more difficult, but again, it doesn't necessarily have to be more expensive. Having inclusive classrooms where you're able to entice teachers to bring their children or grandchildren in and be peer models can be a very powerful way to have to help recruit staff. Inclusion requires intentional collaboration and teaming. We've talked about that, and that takes time. It takes administrative support. And we know that access, membership, participation, friendships, and support are what comes from and what make up high quality inclusion. And then finally, children do not need to be ready for programs. Programs need to be ready for children. Now, Lori told us some caveats around that, and she's exactly right. But we can make our programs ready for just about every child for some period of time. I know we can do it. I've seen it done. And I think that it's up to us to promote that. So I'm going to stop and see if there's any questions about the research that we have.
I don't have any questions. Quite a few have signed into the document, but I don't have any questions at this time. And I'll let you know as soon as they pop
Thanks,
up.
Roberta. So all children, when I say all, I really do mean all. All children with disabilities can be satisfactorily educated in regular early childhood programs. And again, this is just a review with specialized instruction, intentional and embedded opportunities, and when there's time for effective collaboration and teaming. Now, Roberta, listen carefully to this because I want to make sure you agree. We didn't talk about this. You can also, we write IEPs for a year, we know that, but we can also front load IEPs. And this is a little bit about what Lori was talking about. We can be very planful, and I agree with Lori. It is so critical to get as many supports in place at the beginning of a child's experience in a regular program as possible. So maybe we want somebody to go into that classroom, to set up the classroom before the child gets there, and then to be with that child the first couple of weeks the child's in that classroom. But then as soon as humanly possible, we want that assistant or that paraprofessional who's not just supporting the child, but also supporting the classroom and the other children in the classroom so that it would enable the child with a disability to have more of the teacher's time, to participate more seamlessly with other children. So just because there is a paraprofessional in a classroom supporting a child with a disability doesn't mean she can't be doing things that are supporting the other children, supporting the regular early childhood teacher, taking a group of children that don't have disabilities so that the teacher has time to plan for, consider, or work with the child with a disability. And of course, all of this takes effective collaboration and teaming time.
I agree with you, and it's part of that RTI preparation that would also, you know, when we think about the multi-tiered system of support, front loading if possible. And you know, I think one of the things that we're always talking about here in Maine is capacity. Do we have that available to us to actually go in and be prepared? That is, you know, a capacity is always an issue, Deb, but I agree that we want to try to have that, you know, available if we can, but again,
it really is our responsibility to try and figure out ways to make this happen. And I really do apologize. It sounds like I'm preaching. I'm not, but I am a converted inclusionist. And this is my, what I kind of like to call my walk of shame. So I taught for many years, worked in the State Department for many years. We had a lot of money going into technical assistance on promoting inclusion. And yet I sat there and I didn't agree. And I struggled so with it. I would be so embarrassed because we're supporting inclusion and I'm sitting there wanting to protect the children that I worked with because I was what they needed, right? I knew I was. And I just struggled with that day in and day out. And then I went to an inclusion institute in Chapel Hill, North Carolina, and I heard Dr. Don Bailey talking, and he shared this model, and he talked about children being on polar ends. So you can be at the top included, or you can be at the bottom in a segregated classroom. You can be just there in any classroom, or you can be receiving specialized instructions and supports. And our children, and we could add the curriculum to this too if we wanted to. And again, my computer is just not cooperating. There we go. We want our children, we have to have our children included in regular early childhood programs, again, starting with as much time as they possibly can spend in that classroom. And that needs to be our mindset, that we start them that way with the specialized instruction and supports that they need within those regular routines and activities. And so I found and I learned that I wasn't against inclusion. I was against us not having the specialized instruction and supports that our children need. And Lori, I also think I hear you saying that as well. We have to figure out what those supports are and then make sure that we can provide them to children in regular early childhood programs. All right. So what do we know from our research and what do we know from our data? Children who start preschool in segregated settings, what do we know about that? They're much more likely to remain in segregated settings. We know that. So if you look at this picture of children, one of the children in this picture has charge syndrome. And you've probably heard me say this before, and I mean no disrespect. This child is not sitting at a table doing circles and pluses like I always had my children do, right? Because it's on the Brigance and I wanted them to know how to make their circles and pluses. This child is learning skills in the context of everyday routines and activities with doing the same kinds of things that other children are doing. And this child is truly deafblind. Can you easily pick the child out, or do you have to look really closely? In case you haven't picked him out, he's the little boy in blue, second from the left. And I've known this young man most all of his life. We also have some newer research, what we know and what we should be doing. This is by Dr. Phil Strain out of, I believe, Colorado, either University of Colorado or University of Denver. There has been no study that assessed social outcomes for children by looking at inclusion versus segregated settings and found segregated settings to be superior. That's really a very big statement. So I want you to think for just a minute about somebody that you really don't like. I mean, conjure up a person. Think of somebody that you just don't like spending any time with at all. Can you come up with one person? All right, now think about what it is you don't like about them. Okay, now I'm not going to ask you to share, but let me know if this is true. Did anybody pick that you don't like them because of their skill level? Or did you pick that you don't like them because they're obsessive talkers, or they're rude, or they have other different social areas that just don't match with yours? Did anybody pick any reason for not wanting to spend time with another person that was other than social skills? Probably not. So we know that social skills are one of the most important things that children can learn. We know from research also that the developmental level of children is not the determinant factor over whether they get or keep a job. It's their social skills. What we know and what we should be doing, again, by Phil Strain, social interaction must be frequent, planned, and carefully promoted by teachers. Children who are typically developing have only shown positive developmental, educational, and attitudinal outcomes from inclusive experiences. This means that all children do better when there is inclusion happening. There's no evidence whatsoever that children with particular types or severity of disabilities cannot be included. And this is such a critical point. I didn't believe it, but I've come to believe it. And if I can help others believe it, I sure want to, because I was diehard against inclusion, thinking that the training that I had and the skills that I had at a time when it wasn't available widely were really critically important. We can teach those skills, we can model those skills, we can apply those skills in regular early childhood settings, and our children are so much better off for it. So are the other teachers, because they learn. Children generalize skills more effectively in inclusive settings. All of us do, right? If you're trying to read instructions on how to put together a lawnmower, let's say, but you're just reading the instructions, you don't even have a lawnmower, it's not going to mean a lot to you. If you've got to cut your grass and you just bought a new lawnmower, then those instructions are much more critical to you in getting that lawnmower put together. And again, as we talked about, inclusive programs tend to be of higher quality. Let's go through our guiding principles really quickly. And this, we really do need to talk about this. Our principles, you may have different principles. what the
Before
statements,
we go
yes,
into
Roberta?
Before we go in that, we do have a couple of comments that you might
Okay.
want to, when we talk about before the guiding principles. And
Okay.
one of the things that that has been mentioned here on this document is that, you know, we have providers and evaluators who really feel that they in telling the parents that their child will fail or not be successful in an inclusionary setting, and it's the best opportunity for them to get their skills before being before being in a kindergarten class. So it might be helpful to just to have the conversation of how do we approach those types of situations, and our providers and our evaluators when you know, they bring the expertise to the table because of their training, yet they're not the expertise in the classroom. They're the ones that are evaluating.
Right. So I would say, let's look at the research, right? You all know I've shared with you, I'm really old. So that's my excuse for not being enlightened. When I started teaching in 1975, children were in institutions. They were coming out of institutions, and for the first time ever, they were being educated in schools. And we did think they needed these kinds of supports. Now, again, we have more and more children with more significant disabilities every year. We did not have children with significant disabilities in 1975, not many, because those children, sadly, many of them did not survive. We didn't have the medical expertise that we have now. So I certainly realize things are different. I realize things have evolved, and I realize things are not easy. But let's look at the research. And I wish I could make everybody understand how critically important it is. And I am going to show you, I'm going to show you some pictures of the young man that I showed you a minute ago, who is deafblind, and just talk a little bit about his trajectory, because his story tells it all. It really tells it all. I think it's a matter of education. I think it's a matter of looking at the research, studying the research. Sometimes we're protecting our way of doing business, right? We've done it this way forever. This is what we believe. This is what we know. But we can do better. We have the research to guide us. I can also say that I don't think I've ever talked with anyone who has embraced inclusive opportunities for young children and decided that it was better to go back to something else. So I think it's going to take honest conversation. It's going to take this kind of research. Let's talk with your PTIs and maybe get some of this conversation going and help families understand. We're also telling families that when we work in a medical model, and it's nothing against a medical model or medical providers. My sister is a speech pathologist. We've had this conversation, and I know I've alienated some speech therapists, but because we don't have time to really talk about these principles all the way through, right? Our time is limited. We may not get through this presentation today, but I think it's really important that we spend the time where we are talking for just a minute. So we want to take our medical model expertise and we want to apply it in the context of everyday routines and activities. Because honestly, we have been teaching children in isolation. We've been getting them skills. My children could recite the alphabet because I was sitting there nodding my head, giving these cues, doing all these kinds of supportive things to have the child do the activity. So the child never really reached the level of generalizing the skill, right? We see that all the time. Children can do these wonderful things sometimes in therapy sessions or individualized sessions, but it's much easier to just start in a regular environment with the appropriate supports, and that might mean some intensive discrete trial training within a regular early childhood program. It can happen there. You can do that kind of thing within a routine and within an activity and routine. We just have to talk together, talk about how to make it happen. Start by taking smaller incremental steps, right? Maybe every child should have a homeroom with typically developing children. Every child should have meaningful experiences throughout the day with typically developing children. Again, like I said earlier, it doesn't mean all day, every day, but this notion of a child has to have this or that or they're going to fail is just not true. Children come with different levels of abilities, and no matter what we do, some children's abilities are not going to be on par with what they're expected to do in kindergarten. That doesn't make them a failure. It makes the program a failure, because we have to bring our children to the next level from where they are. The best way to do that, especially when they're young, is to have them included and learn from their peers. Those gaps we all know widen for children with significant disabilities as they get older. This is the opportune time to do it. So I know that sounded like a lecture, and I apologize for that.
And I just want to think, because another question has popped up about the 1-to-1 ratio. And I just want my staff to understand that they are empowered to start with a continuum of services, meaning the least restrictive option, moving towards, based on data collection, towards a more restrictive setting. So we don't start with a 1-to-1. We think about maybe a 4-to-1 or a 3-to-1, depending on the needs of the child, so that, like you said, you have an ed tech available, or you have support staff available in a classroom that has, 10 children in it that will be supporting that child and other children in that classroom. So
Roberta, that's so critical what you just said. We do not want to see children who have assistants, paraprofessionals, supports attached directly to that child. We want there to be support in the classroom, but not for a particular child. And I hope that the funding formula doesn't support that. Sometimes it does, but that's an education piece, right? And I can tell you, I saw this all the time. I was guilty of it myself. So I had a child that I was transitioning into kindergarten by having him go out of our self-contained classroom for a period of time. It started out very slowly, like Lori talked about. He went down there with me for a couple of hours a day. The hardest part was getting him down the hall, because I would walk behind him. I wanted to teach him how to get all the way to the classroom without my help. And because I had 12 children in my self-contained classroom, and when I took 12 children with some very challenging behaviors down the hall, we walked to each doorway and we stopped, and they had to wait for me because I didn't want any of them getting out too far ahead of me. So I taught them that. Then when it was time to try and teach this little fella how to get down to the kindergarten classroom, he stopped at every hallway. And I'd have to say, "Why? What are you doing?" He's like, "Well, I'm waiting for you." I said, "Well, where are you supposed to be?" "Well, I'm supposed to be in Miss Fritz's class." "Okay, go, go, go." So I had to retrain what I trained him to do in the first place, right? So, yep. But let me talk about the point of the assistant. Once he got down there, I would try to fade in the background. My responsibility was to help that classroom teacher. And back then, we got classroom teachers to volunteer who would take the child from my classroom. No, these children are everybody's children. They are regular education children, first and foremost. Our support comes secondary for each of these children. So that's a mindset we just have to change. He'd sit in the classroom, and he had an assistant. There was an assistant who was wanting to be very supportive of this little fella. The teacher would say, get a blue crayon. Uh-huh. And before he could even process what was being said, there was a blue crayon magically appearing in front of him. We are putting our least trained folks with our most needy children when we assign them all day long to children. Now, there are some things that children need, whether it's potty training or whether it's, that's different. I'm not talking about that. In the classroom, our paraprofessionals need to support the teacher and all children in helping to support the young child with a disability. And we can talk about that on another call in more detail. Right. Because we are going to run out of time.
We are going to run out of time, but I think I'll tell you, our conversation right now that we're talking about, Deb, has sparked a lot of comments here on your documents, which you'll be able to see. And I think one of the things that we might want to consider is maybe some kind of visual that talks about the continuum of services that would be an aid in an IEP meeting to talk about, this is where, for a newly referred child or a child that is just now going to have some support, what does the family need to see to understand the continuum of services and to be part of that conversation in the IEP team meeting that will help them understand that we don't start with a 1-to-1 right away until we put these other things in place to say your child's making progress this way and we don't need to be more restrictive.
So I'm also going to start too by saying that I think we also have to look at our language, right? We don't even want to talk about this concept of 1-to-1. You know what that is? That is 24/7 special education. That exactly. Is the most restrictive placement you could possibly have for a child. So we want to change that vernacular to something else. Maybe extra support. I don't know. Y'all can come up with that. But we need to change the mindset of what that support needs to look like. And again, go ahead.
I'm just going to say, I see a lot of support for a visual. So that's something that I probably can put the program managers into working on in their program manager meeting when we meet again. But I just wanted to say, I think it's all about empowering our people to help with the IEP team meeting, which does require a lot more professional development. And by the size of the document that's growing here and the request around more training, I think is going to be what we're looking for. And like you said, we've only got 10 minutes left. I don't know if you can get through those guiding principles, but we can start there if you'd like.
Yep, and we can pick this up if people want to continue talking about it. It really is critically important. I wish we were in the same room so that we could really talk more about this, but I am going to say, and I know it sounds a little harsh, but the law requires that we start with this mindset. And yet over time, we have allowed ourselves to really look at things a little differently for a lot of reasons, right? We forget these steps, and that's why it's so critical that we go back to our guiding principles. All right, we're going to go through them. These are meant to spark conversation. Not all of them are statements. They are statements of fact, but as most statements of fact, there's some caveats around them. So you're going to see something, and I hope you speak up because they're meant to spark our discussion. And if we were in a room together, we'd have much more meaningful discussion than me sitting here and not being able to see or hear your comments. So I was going to have you share a guiding principle in the chat. What do you believe is critically important in making sound LRE placement decisions? What is critically important for children and families? Anybody want to unmute and share a principle? What do you all believe in when you look at these young children with disabilities as our responsibility? You might want to do that.
Put in the Google Doc. It's hard to kind of make these LRE placement decisions when we don't have that continuum of service in a lot of our counties. If we had a school that I know the child can start in a special ed setting, or they could start in that regular ed 50-50 setting, and if they're not successful, it's not an issue. We can move them into the appropriate environment. It's really hard for administrators now.
And we're talking about creating a system that's going to support young children. So another thing, I think, let's think about what our principles are for young children birth to 3, right? We serve them in the community. We serve them where they are. We go to childcare if they're in childcare. We might go to the library. So if you're in a setting that just has self-contained classrooms, and we understand some of the issues, it's perfectly fine to look for other opportunities where children are to have that time together. So I'm also not saying that we want to physically put each child in a regular early childhood program and only when they really struggle, move them down the continuum. I'm saying we have very thoughtful conversations about what it looks like and what it takes for every child. But we have to get away from what the programs we have drive the services children are getting, right? So the other thing about this is it's not that hard to make the first step going to where our children are. That one's a little bit easier. Can we start there? And I'm not talking about as an absolute. Can we go there for part of the time? Can we provide some service in those kind of environments? And there are ways that we can do that we'll hold for another conversation. But I think this first conversation is all about, can we change our mindset to really giving serious thought for each child? Whether we have that piece of the continuum in place right now or not, what could it look like? The really cool thing about preschool is we're not confined to classroom walls. We can really think about, do we have a library time? Can we create a library time? Can we build up a Mother's Day Out type program within our school building or within our CDS program? I mean, there are lots of different ways to create these opportunities. And my goodness, we're thinking about for 3-year-olds 6 hours a week. So it's doable. We just have to really think outside the box about what do we need to do in our communities. Now, the other thing I want to say about the continuum is you don't have to have every type service setting in the continuum up and running at full speed. You have to be prepared to create the setting that a child needs based on when they need it, right? And so for school age, that's much easier. For preschool, that's a little bit harder. So we have to be creative, but we also have to be planful. And by being planful, I'm not talking about having a classroom set up for each type of level on the continuum. I'm talking about doing a community scan, seeing what's available in your community, seeing what supports you have, seeing how you can create other opportunities if you don't have them. And I know that's a big lift. I'm certainly not saying any of this is easy. Anybody else? Anything else in the Google Doc, Roberta? I think we're going to make this a two-part conversation if you're okay with that.
I am okay with that. I mean, I know that we're meeting again in June,
Okay.
before summer ends. So maybe that's something where we continue this conversation and we can evidently get into those guiding principles a little deeper or a little more. I think that what's happened here, and maybe you could talk a little bit about further talk about community opportunities. So if a child is newly identified, but maybe in a daycare versus a preschool, how does that support on the continuum look like as a child might be accessing a daycare opportunity versus a preschool classroom or an early intervention setting?
Sure, absolutely, we can do that. So I hope that we can talk some more. I think the first step is, and what we know, there are two things that keep inclusion from happening. There are two main buckets that keep inclusion from happening. The one that most of our researchers talk about the most is attitude. And what I can tell you from my experience in working with programs all across this country is where people want to make it happen, that old saying, where there's a will, there's a way, they do make it happen. They make it happen regardless of funding. They make it happen regardless of the oversight that they get from their leaders, right? Like, it's always easier when you've got clear guidance and clear rules. In some places where they don't have that, it's scary to take a walk and make sure that you're doing things correctly with your funding, or that you're doing things, and so many of us have to then revert to, well, we'll ask for forgiveness instead of, ask for permission. But we know attitude is huge. And that's why we're spending so much time on this conversation. I wish I could, I do want to show you two more slides though before we leave today. I think this is important. So sorry about that. Let me see if I can get to them very quickly, because I know we're running at the end of our time here. Let's see if I can get to them.
And one of the challenges while you're looking for those, Deb, that we have in Maine is that, the IEP is a educational plan, but it's also become our billing document. So when we do a fee for service, we're almost, our hands are almost tied, because in order to bill for those fee for services, we must, have this on the IP, or we must have that on the IP. And so I think that's a deeper conversation for us to have here in Maine at the admin level, but that seems to be tying our hands as well. And maybe you and I can have that conversation after as well.
I think we should. I just want to show you, are you seeing my screen, I hope?
Yes.
Okay. I want to show you that young man. This young man in the picture on the left, that's him in middle school.
We see your Google Drive. I don't know that we don't see it.
All right, let me go back to find the right screen. Oh, goodness. Stop sharing. Try it again. I don't want advanced. I just want easy sharing. Let's go to easy sharing. All right. All right. Now let's see what happens here. One participant can share at a time. Okay. I guess I have to stop sharing. Maybe that's what they're asking me to do. I've never seen Zoom like this, quite like this before. All right.
Well, we had an update here in the States.
Here we go.
That's
Here we
probably
go.
fine.
All right. Now tell me if you're seeing that screen.
Yes.
All right. I just want to end with two things, and then I hope we'll be able to continue the conversation. The young man on the left in middle school had a group of peer buddies. I went to visit him at his home when he was in the, I don't know, 4th or 5th grade. went in the house, visited with his mom, asked where he was. She said, oh, he's playing next door. He had been taught how to stay, on grass. He knew different surfaces. This young man was also in the marching band. They found over time that he had more residual hearing than he had vision, which was absolutely amazing. But I'm going to tell you, none of this would have happened, not any of this would have happened if this child hadn't started in a regular preschool program for some of his time and get to know some of his peers. So it made a believer out of me, along with Don Bailey's little circle image. So I think our next step is to talk about what these supports and services can look like in the context of regular early childhood programs, and finish our discussion about these philosophical changes. So thanks so much. I think we might have gone over a minute. Nope, maybe not. Maybe we're right on.
I think we're right on time. I really appreciate that. I'll leave that. I think we'll leave the Google Doc open for a bit, even though if you may leave the meeting and you still want to add some comments or questions, especially as we think about LRE conversation continuing in June. I think that feel free to add to the document. And again, I know some of you took really a lot of time out of your day to attend this. And I want to say thank you again for all that you do and for attending this today. And we will continue the conversation in June. So if you need to leave or go to a meeting, I appreciate that you attended this morning.
Thanks so much for all the honest conversation, everybody. Have a great day. Roberta, can you stay on and we can?
I can and will.
Okay. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone.